He offered them a ride, said he was just going hunting. Out here in the frozen wild of Alaska, that wasn't strange. But when the plane lifted off and the trees disappeared below, that's when the real hunt began. Because Robert Hansen wasn't after animals. He hunted women. You're listening to Midnight Crime Stories, where every whisper carries a shadow and every night holds a darker secret. Tonight we follow the cold, calculated steps of Robert Hansen, a quiet baker by day, a skilled hunter by hobby, and one of Alaska's most chilling serial killers. They called him the Butcher Baker. She didn't know where she was, only that the trees were too tall, the silence too thick, and the man behind her had a gun. Her name was Cindy Paulson. 17 years old, a dancer, used to harsh looks and harder nights. But nothing had prepared her for this. The plane ride had been short, from the outskirts of Anchorage to what looked like nowhere. A flat of dirt and trees, surrounded by miles of untamed wilderness. She remembered the handcuffs digging into her wrists. The strange way he smiled, not with joy, but with a kind of eerie calm. Robert Hansen. He untied her legs calmly, lifted her out of the plane like a sack of groceries, and said, "Run." She blinked, confused. He didn't say it again, just leaned against a tree and started loading the rifle slung across his back. Cindy ran. The ground was uneven, her shoes gone, her feet slapping against frost-hardened dirt. Branches clawed at her arms. Shadows danced like ghosts through the trees. Behind her, the slow rhythm of boots. Steady, patient. She didn't scream. She knew no one would hear. This was his playground. Then a sound, not from behind, from ahead. Water, a stream. She bolted toward it, praying it might lead to a road, or at least slow him down. She tripped, landed hard. Her hands tore on rock. She could hear his breathing now, slow, calm, steady. But then a gunshot. She didn't feel pain. He missed. Cindy scrambled to her feet, dove into the stream. It was ice cold. It bit into her ribs like knives. But she kept moving. That was the last thing she remembered clearly. When she woke, she was in a hospital. A nurse adjusting her IV, a cop at the door, and a question in the air. Why didn't anyone believe her? Because Robert Hansen looked like no monster at all. He was polite, church-going, a father, a baker, and no one not yet knew he had a private plane, a hunting cabin deep in the woods, and a secret life soaked in blood. Cindy's escape would be the crack that split open a nightmare. But before that, there had been others, and no one had listened. By daylight, Robert Hansen was invisible. He wasn't the kind of man you'd notice at a glance, quiet, soft-spoken, a little awkward perhaps. The kind of man who apologized when you bumped into him, who always held the door for women who baked fresh bread for the church bake sale. To most in Anchorage, he was just Bob the Baker. He ran a small bakery in the city's East End. Opened before dawn, flour on his sleeves, cinnamon rolls rising in the window. Children waved at him through the glass. He always waved back. That was Bob. But people didn't know about the scars. Not the physical ones, though. There were plenty. Acne had ravaged his face in his teenage years, leaving behind pitted reminders of a youth spent in front of mirrors, cursing God for the cruel joke. His speech impediment didn't help. He stuttered badly. Kids mocked him mercilessly. Teachers overlooked him. Girls ignored him completely. He carried all of that into adulthood, like a weight chained to his ribs. In interviews years later, some psychologists would say, it started there in the bruises of adolescence, never healed, never processed. That his hatred had fermented quiet and slow like sourdough rising in the dark. But no one saw it, not even his wife. Darla, a shy, devout woman who believed deeply in redemption. She met Bob at a Bible study group. He brought cookies. She laughed at his jokes, awkward as they were. He liked that she didn't flinch at his face, that she listened patiently when his words stumbled. They married quickly. They had 2 kids, a modest house, a Sunday routine. To Darla, Bob was a man redeemed. He'd confessed early in their relationship to some youthful mistakes, a fire he'd started as a teenager, time served. But he prayed about it. He was sorry. She believed in grace. She didn't know about the shed behind the bakery, or the cabin deep in the woods, or the plane. That was the key. The Piper Super Cub. A small, single-engine aircraft that could land on dirt, snow, or ice. Bob had earned his pilot's license quietly without fuss and kept the plane in a private hangar at Merrill Field. It was his escape, his freedom. It was his hunting tool. Alaska in the 70s and 80s was still wild in many ways. Thousands came north chasing oil money isolation, or both. Anchorage pulsed with transient lives. Loggers, truckers, dancers, drifters. A city where people disappeared easily, especially women, especially the kind no one missed. Runaways, addicts, sex workers. That's who Robert Hansen hunted. He'd cruise 4th Avenue after dark, the red light spine of the city. He'd pick them up, always polite, always calm. He'd pay them. He'd listen, and then he'd snap. But no one saw it coming, because Hansen wasn't sloppy. He wasn't loud. He didn't leave bodies in the street. He flew them out, took them to the wilderness. The cabin, no neighbors, no witnesses. Then he released them and hunted, one by one. Back in the city, though, he was just the baker again. Anchorage police had a problem, but they didn't see the pattern. Not yet. In a city that averaged more than 100 missing persons a year, a few vanishing women didn't sound alarms. Especially not women who lived on the edges. But Officer Greg Baker, no relation to Hansen, started to see something. A few reports, a few names, familiar ones. Girls who'd been picked up, briefly booked, then gone. He kept a file, scribbled notes, nothing official, just a hunch. And then came Cindy Paulson. Cindy's story didn't add up to most. A 17-year-old sex worker found barefoot, handcuffed, and hysterical, claiming she'd escaped from a private plane hangar. that a man had taken her, flown her out to the bush and hunted her. It sounded like a movie or a lie. But Officer Baker believed her because she remembered things, details, the color of the plane, the number on the tail, even the layout of the cockpit. She described a man with glasses, a stutter, a quiet voice, a man who looked harmless. They checked flight logs, and there he was, Robert Hansen. But even then they hesitated, because Hansen had an alibi. A friend vouched for him, said they were together that night playing poker. A judge believed it, and just like that, he slipped away again. But Cindy had lit the match, and the fire was coming. They say Alaska hides secrets in the trees, and Robert Hansen built one of his darkest in a clearing near the Knik River, a place where no one would hear the screams, and even fewer would think to look. The cabin wasn't much, just 4 wooden walls, a tin roof, a cot, and a place to hang meat. To an outsider, it looked like a hunter's refuge, which in a way it was. But not for deer, not for moose, for prey that ran on 2 legs. The women never stood a chance. Robert Hansen knew the terrain better than anyone. He'd studied it, tracked through it for years. Even when there was no snow, he could find his way by the texture of the moss, the bend in the trees, the way the wind curled through the brush. The woods were his kingdom. And in that space, he wasn't stuttering Bob. He wasn't the acne-scarred nobody from high school. He was in control. He was God. When Cindy Paulson escaped bleeding frozen barefoot, she left more than trauma behind. She left doubt. In Robert, in the story he told police, in the alibi that had holes no one had seen before. But for a while things still quieted. Months passed. The Anchorage Police Department returned to its usual chaos. No new bodies, no new reports. The noise of the city drowned out the whispers. And Robert went back to baking. The cinnamon rolls, the pies, the same quiet smile. But inside the hunger was coming back. The next girl, like most, was a ghost before she was even gone. Her name was Paula. Blonde. 20. She'd only been in Anchorage for 3 weeks. She met Bob at a diner off 3rd Avenue. He asked if she wanted to make a little money. She said sure. He smiled gently, helped her into his car. She was never seen again. In the heart of winter, Alaska doesn't blink. Darkness swallows entire days. Roads vanish in snow. It's easy to get lost out there and easier to lose someone. Robert took Paula to the cabin, tied her to the post with the same yellow rope, gave her a head start like the others, watched her run into the tree line, her breaths turning into puffs of fog. Then he picked up the rifle. He liked to wait, to feel the fear settle into them, thick as frost on the back of their necks. He liked the stillness just before the scream. The FBI didn't get involved until the bodies started to surface. Some weren't whole. Some were just bones, found by hunters, snowmobilers, or the occasional bear dig. But they all shared similarities. Zip ties, bullet wounds, and sometimes jewelry. Rings, earrings, trinkets that hadn't yet sunk into the soil. Agent John Douglas, One of the bureau's leading profilers was called in. He sat with the case files, studied the locations, mapped the remains. Each red dot on the forest map drew a pattern. And at the center, Anchorage and someone who hunted. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't even a crime of impulse. This was methodical, ritualistic, calculated. The profile they developed was chillingly accurate. A white male in his 30s or 40s, socially awkward, likely had a job that didn't require much interaction, skilled with weapons, possibly had a stutter, maybe a hunter, or even a pilot. It was like describing Robert Hansen by name. But a profile isn't proof. Back in Anchorage, one officer couldn't let go. Sergeant Glenn Floth, Cindy Paulson's story had burned into his mind. So had the way Hansen had slipped through their fingers. Floth reopened the case quietly. He started interviewing dancers again, women from the streets. Many didn't want to talk, but a few remembered Bob. Nice guy, they said. A little weird. He always paid. Until he didn't. One girl had been tied up by him but got away. Another remembered being taken to the airport, but she got cold feet. All stories. No evidence until Floth had an idea. What if they searched his house? They needed a warrant, but the judge needed more. So Floth built it piece by piece. Cindy's testimony, the pilot's license, the matches between the profile and Bob's life, the missing persons, the rope, the plane. It took months. And then, one morning in 1983, a knock came at the Hansen home. Robert answered in an apron flower on his fingers. He didn't flinch. The search turned up everything. The walls in his basement were covered in guns, but it was the box under the floorboards that held the truth. Inside, jewelry, ID cards, a .223 caliber rifle, a map marked with little red X's, each X lined up with a body or a place yet to be found. It was the final piece. They had him. But even then, Robert Hansen denied it. He stuttered, cried, said he was being framed. But then, slowly, the mask fell and he began to talk, one story at a time, each more horrifying than the last. Robert Hansen didn't confess like most killers. There were no tears, no redemption, no apologies, just facts whispered slowly, with the same calm, steady tone he used to order eggs at the diner or frost a cake in his bakery. He didn't even ask for a lawyer. Just leaned back in the interview room, crossed his arms, and started to talk. They brought in maps, photos, names, and one by one he confirmed them. Yes, that was Sherry. Yes, that was where he left her. Yes, he took her out in the plane, told her to run, waited for the fear to build before he started the chase. The same method again and again. He liked that part, the chase, not the kill, not the blood, just the moment he was more powerful than anyone had ever let him be. They never looked at me. Back then, he said. His voice was almost childlike. In school, I was nothing, just a stuttering freak. Girls laughed. So I made them stop. The room went quiet. The agents didn't press him, didn't interrupt, just listened. Because sometimes the devil talks loud, but other times he whispers. Robert admitted to at least 17 murders. 17. But there were more X's on the map, some in places where no body had ever been found. And when asked about them, he would just smile faintly. "I don't remember," he said. But he did. They knew he did. He just liked that they didn't. That final grip of control, even now in handcuffs behind a table, beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, Robert Hansen was still hunting, still in control. Cindy Paulson's name came up again, the one who escaped, the one who ran barefoot through the river and somehow lived. They asked him about her. He blinked. "Yeah," he said softly. "She was different." "Different how?" He shrugged. "She didn't freeze. A beat. She looked me in the eye, like she'd seen men like me before. But she still ran." The Anchorage press caught wind of the case before it went public. They dubbed him the Butcher Baker. It stuck. The town was shocked, not just because of the crimes, but because of who committed them. Robert had been a friendly face, donated pies to the school, sat in church pews with his wife, taught his kids how to fish, and yet, behind the walls of his home, he was collecting trophies of the dead. Earrings, driver's licenses, clumps of hair, each one stored in little baggies, tucked inside the ceiling tiles, like a hunter counting kills. The court proceedings were quiet. Robert pled guilty, sparing the victims' families the agony of a trial. But in exchange, he asked for one thing: to serve his sentence out of state, away from Alaska, the place he called home, the place that made him, the place he buried them. The judge said no, and Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison, plus life, without the possibility of parole. But some say that even in prison, he never stopped. He told stories, changed details, played with timelines, left just enough mystery in his voice to make the guards wonder. How many more? Years later, when asked why he did it, Robert said something simple: "Because I could." And when asked what he felt for the women, he looked up and said, "Fear. I liked their fear. It made me feel real." Back in Anchorage, the community tried to move on. The streets were swept, the cabins torn down, the woods stayed silent. But Cindy Paulson, she didn't fade into the shadows. She testified, told her story again and again, to judges, to students, to anyone who would listen. Because sometimes surviving isn't just about running. It's about making sure no one forgets. Anchorage wasn't a city that usually made the front page. It was quiet, cold, surrounded by wilderness, a place where people knew their neighbors, or thought they did. But when Robert Hansen's crimes came to light, everything shifted. Overnight, the city became a headline, not for its glaciers, not for its moose or mountain trails, but for what had been hiding just beneath the snow. In coffee shops, no one sat near the windows. In grocery stores, eyes lingered too long on the faces behind them. Everyone wondered the same thing: how could he be one of us? Because Robert Hansen didn't look like a killer. He didn't snarl or scream or stumble through rage. He wore an apron. He baked bread. He smiled at old women and held the door for strangers. And yet, behind those eyes, he had hunted, deliberately, cruelly, with a patience that chilled the bones. The papers didn't hold back. The Butcher Baker exposed. Anchorage's serial killer had wings. 17 girls gone and no one noticed. The town was furious. At him, at themselves, at the system. Because Cindy Paulson had come forward months before he was caught. And no one believed her. Because she was young. Because she danced in clubs. Because she had a record. Because victims like her weren't heard until they were dead. The investigation had been long, frustrating. In the early 80s, missing women in Alaska, especially sex workers, were rarely a priority. But Detective Glenn Floth didn't agree. He'd read Cindy's original statement, saw the cracks in Hanson's alibi, and refused to let it go. The man has a plane, he told his team. He has weapons, a cabin, and a pattern. They began mapping the disappearances. Names, dates, last seen locations, and a chilling picture emerged. Most of them vanished near the same strip, then were never seen again. The real breakthrough came when one of Hanson's friends, a mechanic, confessed something odd. Robert had once asked him to upgrade the storage on his Piper Super Cub plane, not for tools, for restraints, harnesses, rope anchors. The friend thought he was joking, but now he wasn't laughing. That's when the FBI was brought in. They profiled Hanson, and what they found was textbook, low self-esteem, a stutter, a history of petty theft and arson in his youth, a deep-seated hatred of women who rejected him. They called him a compensatory killer, someone who needed power, needed to dominate, and found a way to do it in a place where the land swallowed secrets. The cabin was the final piece, a tiny wooden structure hidden deep in the Matanuska Susitna Valley. No road in, just trees and silence. When police reached it after Robert had already been arrested, what they found chilled them. Rope, weapons, a blood-stained mattress, and nailed to the wall a faded photo of a moose with bullet holes surrounding it, like a twisted trophy room. But there were no smiles, no grins of victory, only ghosts. Cindy Paulson, by this time, was living far from Anchorage, but the reporters found her. They wanted her story, wanted a face to go with the horror. But Cindy, she was tired. Tired of being asked to relive it. Tired of the looks. Tired of being both survivor and spectacle. She gave one interview, only one, and in it, she said, "I wasn't the first. I just ran faster." The city mourned, not with flowers, not with speeches, but with silence. Bars closed early. Taxi rides doubled at night. And young women began to carry knives. Some even moved away, fled the cold, fled the forests, fled the memory. Because in a place like Anchorage, people used to trust the quiet ones. And Robert Hanson was very quiet. There's a theory some locals have whispered, not shouted, that Robert didn't work alone, that someone helped, covered, turned a blind eye. Because how else could one man do so much? For so long, the cabin, the plane, the victims. Could it really have been just him? The police say yes, but the town, it still wonders. Especially those who live near the tree line. Especially on nights when the snow falls heavy and the woods go still. Detective Glenn Floth stared down at the stack of manila folders on his desk, each one marked with a date. each one with a missing woman's name, and each one with a photo of a smile that would never be seen again. He had been following the pattern for months. Girls, mostly dancers, sex workers, young women with few ties. Gone, vanished. Some resurfaced later in pieces, but others simply became whispers in the winter wind. And now he had a name, Robert Hansen. It started with Cindy Paulson, but Flood had since tracked down flight logs, private plane registrations, purchase records, a map, and that map held pins, red ones. Each pin matched a body found or a location described by Cindy. Or worse, a spot in the Alaskan wilderness where no one dared go. Flother reached for his recorder, hit play. Cindy's voice crackled through. He said he liked to hunt, not deer, not moose, but girls who didn't scream. He said it was better when they ran. Flother's blood turned cold. He had enough to request a warrant. July 13th, 1983. Hansen was at work when they searched his house. What they found confirmed everything. Guns, dozens. A hidden crawl space beneath the floor of his attic. Inside jewelry from the victims, ID cards, makeup cases, a pair of blood-stained boots. But most damning, a folded map with red X's, exactly matching the burial sites. They brought him in. Hansen sat quiet, calm. He denied it. At first, said it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Said he'd never hurt anyone. But Flother placed the map on the table, and Hansen stared, long, unblinking. Then he said, "Some of them begged." I didn't like that. And the silence that followed was worse than any scream. It began in the cold gray of November 1983. A courtroom in downtown Anchorage, blanketed by snow outside and silence within. The state of Alaska versus Robert Christian Hansen. Cindy Paulson sat outside the courtroom, her hands trembling just slightly, her eyes watching a clock that seemed to move too slow. This was the moment she'd fought to get to, but the dread in her stomach didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival still clinging to the walls of her memory. The trial wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was clinical evidence, photos, maps, expert testimony, and the quiet voice of a prosecutor who knew he had something rare, a living witness. Hansen sat still, unmoved, wearing a brown jacket and glasses that slightly reflected the courtroom lights. He didn't look like a monster that was part of the horror. His defense, insanity, stress, upbringing. The usual gray fog thrown over acts drenched in red, but the evidence was relentless. Shell casings matched his rifle. Boot prints matched his hunting gear. Jewelry belonging to victims found in a hidden crawl space. A detailed map hand-marked with little red X's, and one of those X's matched exactly where Cindy had said he tried to kill her. It was a chilling moment. The courtroom was still even. The judge leaned slightly forward. Then came the confession. It wasn't screamed. It wasn't emotional. Robert Hansen simply sat in a small room away from the jury, and with his lawyer beside him, He talked. "I guess I got tired of the fantasy," he said. "Wanted the real thing." He described his first kill like he was describing a camping trip. She panicked, screamed. "I didn't like that, but I shot her." It was quiet after. He admitted to abducting women, flying them out in his plane, releasing them into the woods, and hunting them. Not all ran. Some begged, some froze, some tried to talk him down. But in the end, it was always the same. Silence, then a shallow grave. Sometimes marked, sometimes not. By the time he was finished, he'd confessed to killing at least 17 women. But police believed the number was higher, much higher. The courtroom stared at the printed transcript of his words. Jurors wore expressions torn between disgust and disbelief. No one had expected this. Not in Anchorage, not from him. When the verdict came, it was clear and crushing. Guilty on all counts: murder, kidnapping, assault, weapon possession. Robert Hansen was sentenced to 4 years plus life with no possibility of parole. He never flinched. Cindy stood outside the courthouse as reporters gathered. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want to be the hero. She just wanted to go home, to sleep without flinching, to believe she was finally safe. And yet, she knew. Out there in the trees, somewhere, under the ice, some victims still hadn't been found. Some families still had no answers. Some red X's on that map had no names. The snow never stopped falling that winter. It blanketed everything: roads, roofs, memories. But beneath it all, the cold Alaskan earth kept its secrets tightly sealed. When the trial ended, a new mission began: recovery. State troopers, forensic teams, dogs trained to sniff for decay. They were all sent back into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The map Hansen had marked became their Bible. Little red X's. Some matched the remains they had already found. Others pointed to frozen silence places where the earth didn't give anything up so easily. They dug anyway. In Matanuska Valley, near a game trail Hansen had frequented, they found bones brittle, weather-worn, a femur, a piece of skull, a single high heel buried beside them. Farther north, under the snowbank by Knik River, another set of remains. No name, no ID, just a small necklace shaped like a heart still resting against a ribcage. One by one, the graves were unearthed. But they weren't just holes in the ground. They were echoes. Each site whispered back the pain, the terror, the final breaths of the women who had been hunted like animals. The press began calling it the Butcher's Trail. For every confirmed victim, there were 2 or 3 red X's still unexplained. The case began to feel infinite, not in terms of horror, but in unanswered questions. Cindy Paulson tried to stay away from the news, but it always found her. She would hear names mentioned in hushed tones, women she might have known, women who might have stood next to her once working a street corner in the dark. One night, she opened a package sent anonymously to the shelter where she now volunteered. Inside was a photograph. A girl, maybe 18, blonde, eyes closed, peaceful, almost like sleeping. Written on the back, she was one of his. Tell her story. Cindy didn't recognize the girl, but her hands shook anyway. Detectives continued their grim work. One said later in an interview, Every time we found a set of remains, it felt like shaking hands with a ghost. But the ghosts weren't angry. They were just waiting, waiting to be remembered, to be called by name again, to be mourned. And some still were never found. The cold doesn't give everything back. Some parts of the forest, especially deep in the remote hunting zones Hansen preferred, were simply too vast, too quiet, too deep. By the end of that year, the official number of confirmed victims rose to 17. Unofficially, the number hovered near 30, maybe more. But the map Hansen had drawn was incomplete. Some red X's didn't lead to remains, just to empty land. A mockery of truth. Or maybe he'd forgotten or lied. Truth, like the bodies, remained buried. Still, the cold case files were closed one by one, and Alaska began to heal, or at least to forget. Even with Hansen locked away, his shadow lingered. In Anchorage, women still checked over their shoulders at night. A cab driver kept a loaded flare gun under his seat, and mothers whispered new rules to their daughters: don't get into a stranger's car, never go out alone, stay away from men with planes. The terror had shifted, no longer the active threat of a predator, but the ghost of one. A psychological scar stitched into the fabric of the city. Cindy Paulson moved twice in that first year. She tried waitressing, failed, tried therapy, walked out halfway through the first session. Nightmares came like clockwork. In them, she wasn't running. She was hiding. And the sound she always heard, not footsteps, not gunshots, wings. A small plane circling overhead, like a hawk. The media circled back now and then. A true crime documentary, a made-for-TV film, a podcast titled Frozen Silence. They all reached out. Cindy refused them all, not because she was ashamed, but because every time she told her story, it brought him back. His face, his smell, his cold eyes behind thick glasses. But one night, sitting in a diner booth under flickering fluorescent light, she opened a manila folder left behind by a journalist. Inside were photos, not of the crime, not of her, but of them, the women, smiling, laughing. At birthdays, on beaches, holding children, holding guitars, holding hope. They weren't just victims. They were people. And something shifted in Cindy. 2 months later, she agreed to do a recorded interview, not about Hansen, but about the girls. She listed their names, the ones she knew, then said they were real. That's all that matters. Not what happened, who they were. The recording aired locally, and then, quietly, it went viral. Cindy's voice, soft and steady, whispered across headphones in bedrooms and buses, in late-night study halls and darkened living rooms. And somehow, that whisper was louder than Hansen's roar. In prison, Hansen never spoke publicly again. He worked in the laundry, took up knitting oddly, never showed remorse. But one night, an inmate in the infirmary claimed Hansen had woken from sleep screaming. "They're in the trees," he whispered. "They're in the trees." Whether it was guilt, fear, or madness, no one knew. But the guards never forgot it, especially when Hansen's health declined. By 2014, he was frail, gray, bent, quiet. He died in August of that year, alone in a hospital bed. No final words, no confession, just silence. But outside in Anchorage, in the quiet night, sometimes people still say you can hear it, the soft hum of a plane engine overhead. And somewhere deeper still, a whisper in the dark. Anchorage moved on, or at least it tried to. But for those who knew the truth, detectives, survivors, families of the lost, the name Robert Hansen never really left the air. It lingered like fog, soft but suffocating. Hansen was transferred to Spring Creek Correctional Center, a maximum security prison nestled in the remote town of Seward. He had a small, sterile cell. No windows, a cot, a toilet, and time, endless time. He didn't fight the sentence, didn't appeal, didn't speak to the press. He simply existed. In prison, he was quiet, courteous. He spent most of his time alone, either reading or pacing. Occasionally, he spoke to prison counselors. But what disturbed them most wasn't what he said it was, what he didn't. No remorse, no sadness, no anger, just silence. One guard once asked him late during rounds, "Do you think about them?" Hansen didn't look up. "Sometimes," he said, "but it doesn't change anything." Another counselor, who had spent years trying to map the mind of serial offenders, wrote in her notes, "Robert Hansen is a void. Not a fire, not a storm, a quiet absence." What he took from his victims wasn't just life. It was voice, identity, and perhaps that is what he wanted most: silence, total and final. Back in Anchorage, Cindy Paulson built a life from the ashes. She moved out of state, eventually changed her name, married, had a son. She didn't tell many people what had happened, but sometimes, when it rained or when she heard the distant sound of a plane overhead, her hands would tremble. One night, years later, her son found her sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "Are you okay, Mom?" She nodded slowly. "Just remembering someone who tried to take everything from me," she whispered. "But he didn't win. I'm still here." In 2014, Robert Hansen died of natural causes in a hospital bed, still in custody. No last words, no statement, just a final, eternal silence. He was buried without ceremony. No headstone, no mourners, no name etched in stone, just a grave, unmarked. And perhaps that's all he ever truly deserved. But the stories, they remain. The map with red X's. The women whose names are now carved in stone. The haunted silence of the Alaskan woods. And the truth that even in the coldest places, evil can bloom quietly. You've just heard part 10, The Man Behind the Silence. Thank you for listening to Midnight Crime Stories. Subscribe for more whispered true crime tales to accompany your sleepless nights. The true end of a crime isn't when the criminal is caught. It's when the silence lifts from those left behind. Cindy wasn't the only one. Over the years, more women stepped forward. Some had escaped. Some had only crossed paths with Hansen briefly, never realizing how close they came to vanishing. There were nightmares that lasted decades, therapy bills that never stopped piling up, relationships ruined by the inability to trust, nights spent checking locked doors 3 times. For Detective Floth, the case never truly left him either. He spoke about it rarely, but every year on the anniversary of Hanson's arrest, he would take a drive alone into the woods outside Anchorage. He never said what he was looking for. Maybe peace. Maybe forgiveness for the ones he didn't find. At the Victims' Memorial in Anchorage, where small plaques now mark the names of the women, a candlelight vigil is held each year. Not everyone who comes knew the victims, but they come anyway to stand against forgetting. One woman, a survivor who never gave her real name once, stepped up to the microphone. She was older now, stronger. She didn't speak long, just one sentence. "We're more than what he tried to make us." The crowd fell silent, but not in fear, in reverence. Alaska remains cold. Its woods remain vast. But those stories whispered from one sleepless night to another, they remain warmer than the man who tried to erase them. And as long as they are told, he never truly wins. Alaska remembers in silence. In the stillness of winter, when the sun barely brushes the sky and snow blankets the earth like untouched pages, the stories buried beneath the ice begin to stir. Some say the wind over the Nick River carries voices. Others say that in the dead of night, if you listen closely near Merrill Field Airport, you'll hear the faint rhythmic hum of a small plane long grounded but never truly gone. This is where Robert Hanson's shadow still lingers. Not in the prison where he died, nor in the unmarked grave where he was buried, but here, in the wild, in the lonely corners of Alaska where his victims disappeared without sound, without struggle, without anyone noticing. Detective Glenn Floth once said that Hanson didn't just hunt, he erased. He found the invisible women and made them disappear even more. But in doing so, he underestimated something: memory. Not just institutional memory, not cold files or redacted reports, but human memory. Cindy Paulson's memory. The memories of the women who came forward. The memories of families who never stopped lighting a candle in front of fading photos. And in that remembering, Hanson's greatest goal was undone. Because silence only wins when no one dares to speak. In the years after the case, Anchorage changed. Slowly, painfully. The city poured resources into missing persons units. They opened shelters specifically for at-risk women. Outreach programs were started where none had existed. Sex workers, so often Hanson's targets, began to be seen not as criminals, but as vulnerable human beings worthy of protection. Cindy, under her new name, volunteered in such places. She didn't need to tell her story. Her presence was enough. And in those shelters, sometimes late at night, when a new girl came in, frightened, shaking, unsure whether this was safety or just another kind of danger, Cindy would make her way over and whisper, "You're not invisible. I see you." Because that was how it had all started. With someone being seen and someone else deciding they shouldn't be. The Alaskan cold still numbs the fingers. The forest still grows thick. The wind still howls through valleys like lost voices. But Hansen's world, the one of silence control and erased names, no longer owns the narrative. Instead, it's women's names that are remembered. Cindy, Andrea, Malai, Angela, Sue, each name spoken softly, each one a defiance against forgetting. Every time this story is told, it is not to relive Hansen's power. It's to reclaim what he tried to steal: visibility, humanity, and voice. And so, in a strange way, this story doesn't end. It just echoes like a whisper in the ice. After Hansen's death in 2014, Alaska exhaled, quietly, as if the land itself was releasing tension it had held for too long. But beneath that sigh of relief, a question remained. What allowed a man like that to operate undetected for over a decade? The answers didn't lie solely in Hansen's psyche, though that was a tangled web of inferiority, resentment, and cold calculation. They lay in the cracks of the system, in a culture that dismissed certain victims, in a justice process that for years failed to connect the dots. It wasn't just one failing, it was many. Officers who labeled missing women as runaways, prosecutors who hesitated to press charges without perfect witnesses, communities that turned away when women on the margins disappeared. Hansen thrived in those silences. Even as his crimes were exposed, a deeper story emerged about how society had made his work easier, and how, without confronting that, another Hansen could rise again somewhere else in another quiet corner. Some detectives continued revisiting cold cases long after Hansen's sentencing. They believed, and still believe, that more victims remain unfound, buried in the wilderness, hidden by time, forgotten by records, but not by intuition. Helicopter teams occasionally search remote forest areas, some led by professionals, others by families who never gave up. GPS grids, old case maps, weathered newspaper clippings. The forest doesn't give up its secrets easily, but it also never forgets. One documentary crew interviewed Cindy years later. She agreed under one condition: that her face not be shown. Her voice, now steady, lower, thoughtful, carried across the screen. She said, "He took too much from too many people, and I won't let him take my peace too." That line stuck, not out of vengeance, but resilience. Because some stories survive not by being screamed, but by being whispered again and again until the silence cracks. And through those cracks, light gets in. The end of winter in Alaska doesn't arrive with celebration. It creeps in, not with blooming flowers or sunny skies, but with subtle shifts. The snow begins to melt into dirty puddles. The ice thins on the lakes, and for the first time in months, the sound of running water returns, a slow, reluctant thaw, as if the land, still wary, isn't sure it's safe to exhale. That's how it felt in Anchorage after the Hansen case. Not relief, not closure, but a quiet, uneasy thaw. People returned to their routines, work, school, the mundane rituals of life. But beneath the normalcy was a collective memory, not spoken aloud, not written in headlines anymore, but carried in glances, in the way women held their keys between their fingers while walking to their cars, in the cautious way parents looked out their windows when their daughters were 5 minutes late coming home. Hansen was dead, but his echo lingered. It was Cindy who first said it out loud, years later, during a small meeting of survivors and advocates. Justice doesn't end with a verdict, she whispered. It ends when women stop disappearing. The room had gone silent. A social worker beside her started to cry, not loudly, not disruptively, just quietly, like the tears were long overdue, waiting for permission to fall. And from that night, something shifted. The city began to change in practical ways. More streetlights were installed along the older parts of Anchorage, where women had once vanished into shadows. Emergency shelters received expanded funding. A unit within the Anchorage Police Department, once under-resourced and overlooked, was restructured to focus exclusively on missing persons and cold cases. But the real transformation was cultural. Workshops began in high schools teaching students about coercion consent and recognizing manipulation. Local journalists committed to using respectful language when reporting on vulnerable populations. And most significantly, sex workers, long dismissed as less than, were included in safety efforts, given hotline access, protection protocols, and support networks. For the first time they were seen. Cindy never went public again. But she didn't disappear. She continued working quietly, always in the background. Volunteers at shelters would speak of a woman, tall, soft-spoken, with a calming presence, who never gave her real name. But when she sat with new arrivals, it was as if they felt instantly seen, understood, held. Once a young runaway with meth withdrawal was thrashing in one of the cots. No one could calm her down, not even the nurses, until Cindy entered the room. She didn't speak right away. She just sat beside the girl and took her hand. The girl, trembling, had whispered, "I thought I was gonna die out there." Cindy responded, "I know the feeling, but you didn't. And that's what matters." The girl fell asleep moments later. No one forgot that night. Meanwhile, the media's fascination with Hansen dimmed. New crimes, new faces, new chaos. But in Alaska, particularly in Anchorage, his name remained etched in the backdrop like a scar. A documentary came out titled Frozen Shadows. It didn't sensationalize. Instead, it focused on systemic failure, the kind that Hansen had exploited. The film interviewed former detectives, psychologists, and advocates. But the most haunting moment came in the final 5 minutes. An overhead drone shot of the Knik River Valley, a snowy, desolate expanse with no visible trails, no landmarks, just emptiness. The narrator said, "Somewhere down there, maybe only a few feet below the frost line, is a name no one ever learned." Fade to black, then silence. Back in 2023, Anchorage experienced its coldest winter in over 2 decades. Blizzards shut down the roads for days at a time. Power lines snapped. Stores ran low on supplies. It felt like nature had folded its arms again, reminding everyone who was in charge. That winter, an old hunter named Jacob Petrosky stumbled upon something. He'd gone out to track caribou prints, but ended up off trail, deep in the woods near Eklutna, an area long associated with rumors, one where teens dared each other to camp and parents warned their kids to avoid. Jacob didn't believe in ghost stories, but what he found that day was no myth. It was bones, buried shallow, tangled in old roots and moss. A scrap of fabric still clinging to one femur, red faded by time. Nearby, a rusted bracelet with one letter barely legible. A. Jacob called the authorities. Forensic teams descended on the site. Days turned to weeks. Eventually, they confirmed it was a woman, aged 25-30. Estimated time of death sometime in the early 1980s. Dental records didn't match any on file. No missing persons report had included her name, but in one locker at APD headquarters, there was an old box unmarked. Inside a note, scribbled in pencil, girl in red. Last seen, 4th Ave. 1982. No ID. Possible runaway. They called her Andrea. The discovery reignited public interest not in Hansen himself, but in those he left behind. Memorials were held. Not grand or televised, but real. Dozens of people gathered near the riverbank that spring. Survivors, journalists, advocates, and a group of girls from a local halfway house, all no older than 19, each clutching a single white rose. They read aloud the names of every confirmed victim, and then they read the unknown ones. Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 2. A pause. Then one of the girls said Andrea, no last name, but said with care, as if just giving her that much brought her back into the world of the living, if only briefly. Meanwhile, the city proposed renaming one of the downtown streets. Cindy didn't speak at the hearing, but she watched from the last row. And when the vote passed unanimously to rename it Survivor's Way, she closed her eyes. Just for a moment. The street signs went up that fall. Robert Hansen died alone. No family, no visitors, no legacy beyond destruction. But what followed wasn't just grief. It was rebuilding, a slow, painful, necessary process of reclaiming space, identity, and voice. In the years since true crime podcasts, YouTube channels, even whispered bedtime stories like this one, began telling the tale not as Hansen's legend, but as a cautionary, haunted chapter. The women once nameless were becoming known. The city once complicit in silence was beginning to speak. And the long Alaskan winter was finally breaking. It's quiet now. Not just the kind of quiet you expect in Alaska. Not the hush of falling snow, or the stillness of a cold, starless night. This is a different kind of silence. One that doesn't demand attention. One that doesn't come with dread. It's the silence that follows survival, and yet, beneath it, something lingers. Because stories like Robert Hanson's don't ever truly end. They soften, they echo, they change shape, but they never vanish. Cindy Paulson lives far from Anchorage now. She changed her name for the second time, moved again, this time to a coastal town where the ocean drowns out memory and no one asks questions about scars that aren't visible. She walks by the water every morning, always at sunrise, always alone. Locals know her only as Miss L, a quiet woman with kind eyes and a soft voice. She never mentions what happened, but some mornings she sits on the pier bench with a notebook in her lap. She doesn't write much, just a name sometimes, a single name. Then closes the notebook and stares at the horizon like it's holding secrets only she's allowed to hear. Back in Anchorage, a new officer joins the cold case unit. Her name is Kira Alvarez, young, sharp, the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She's never seen snow before her first week on the job. But she's read everything about the Hansen case, not out of fascination, out of obligation. Her first day, she's given a stack of unsolved disappearances, women gone from 1979 to 1983. No photos, only basic descriptors. A lot of unknown hair color, last seen on 4th Avenue, possible transient. They don't even have case numbers, just boxes. Old cardboard files with yellowed paper and ink smudges. And for every name crossed off as identified, another one surfaces no match, no DNA, no hope. Still, Kira doesn't give up. She marks one name in particular, B if, approx. 26. Last seen, People's Drugstore. Clothing green jacket, black boots. Nothing else. She reads it 3 times, then whispers aloud, "You deserve better." It's not much, but it's something. Meanwhile, a podcast episode titled Satan in the Skirt, The Butcher of Alaska trends on Spotify's top 10. A new generation hears the story through earbuds in coffee shops on commutes before bed. Some listen out of curiosity, some out of fear, but some listen because they recognize something in the silences, a chill that isn't just the weather, a wrong turn taken one night too many, a man whose smile felt too rehearsed. The episode ends with this line: he hunted women like they were prey. But what he didn't know is that their stories would outlive him. The final 5 seconds are just wind sounds, like breathing. It's downloaded over 3 million times. In Alaska, the weather turns again. Fall dies fast up north. There's no gentle easing into winter, just a gust, then frost, then days that shrink until darkness owns the sky. One night, a hiker finds an old thermos lodged beneath some brush near Rabbit Creek. Inside is a scrap of fabric blood-stained, an earring, a Polaroid so damaged only a hint of a face can be seen. It's enough. Forensics dated to 1981. Likely one of Hansen's. They catalog it, archive it. Another fragment of a woman who once laughed and walked alone at night, thinking she'd make it home. Kira hears about it and doesn't sleep for 2 days. She reopens the case logs. One of the names, Rachel A., seen with thermos purple jacket, now means more than before. She calls in a new DNA swab, just in case. Elsewhere, in a university lecture hall, a professor of forensic psychology uses Hansen as a case study. Low self-esteem, she says. Acute inferiority complex. Early criminal behavior tied to arson. A man who projected violence outward rather than confronting weakness inward. A student raises their hand, but why target sex workers? The professor pauses, then answers softly, because they were the ones society didn't fight for. He didn't pick them because they were easy. He picked them because he thought no one would care. The room goes silent, not out of fear, out of shame. Years pass. Cindy ages. So does the city. But the story remains. It's whispered now in books on YouTube, in quiet support groups. Mothers tell their daughters about walking in pairs. Girls in shelters share warnings with each other about names they don't trust. Officers are trained to listen differently, to document better, to ask softer questions. And in Anchorage, a mural appears near 4th Avenue, painted by a survivor. It shows a line of women walking forward, heads held high, shadows stretching behind them, not from darkness, but from light they're walking into. In the corner, one name is painted in small script, Cindy. No last name. But everyone knows, somewhere tonight, someone is walking home in the dark. They pass a street light that flickers. They check behind them. Nothing there. But they feel it. The hum of the story. The residue of something that once was and never quite left. And maybe, just maybe, they whisper to themselves, I'm not invisible, because that was the point all along. Thank you for listening to Midnight Crime Stories. Subscribe for more whispered true crime tales to accompany your sleepless nights.